today's video, we will be doing a deep dive into the Cypher trait. Cypher is one of the strongest traits in the game right now, and if you're not playing into it, you are definitely missing out on some free LP. It's not super flexible, and if you mess up your transitions, it can definitely punish you hard, but if you play it right, it can pretty consistently convert into some top finishes. So today, we'll go over how the trait works, the two main variations you'll see in high elo, a very niche third variation that's not very popular for a couple of good reasons, and what you need to focus on to actually close games with Cypher. But before that, thanks to Riot Games, we have given away 5 tier 1 base Chibi Jana Little Legends for TFT. The winners have been picked, and congratulations to these 5 commenters for winning the giveaway. I'll put their little comments up on the screen. Check your Discord DMs and make sure they're open because I'll be reaching out shortly right after I'm done filming this video. Thank you again to Riot for letting us be a TFT partner. But with that out of the way, let's go over the actual trait, the units, the itemization, and then we'll talk about the variations, and then if there's some time, we'll go over a VOD review. I don't know how long this is going to be. But first off, let's talk about Cypher. So what does the trait actually do? Cypher, the trait, basically gains intel once it's active by losing combat, but it's increased for loss streaks. So basically, if you are able to keep losing more and more and more, you'll gain more intel per loss. You also get a little bit of bonus intel for killing units. So basically, the trait's rewarding you if you are able to kill units and then still lose. That is the best way to play the trait. You can also then trade all that intel for loot one time on one singular round, and this is very fixed. It's either on 3-3, 3-7, 4-3, 4-7, or 5-5. Also, after trading the intel, the Cypher champions will gain AD and AP. They gain 30 for 3 active, 45 to get 4 active, and then they get 55 to get all 5 Cypher units in your board, which is a lot of stats, but most of the time you aren't really warranted to play all 5 Cypher units on your board. Most of the time you take down to 3, but we'll talk about that with the variations in just a little bit. On screen right now, what you see as well are, so the left side here is sort of like the BIS, and we'll talk about why this is the case, and then you'll see like alternative items that some of the units can use, and a little bit of like some artifacts that you can consider that are pretty good on said units. First off is Zed. Zed, his BIS is going to be IE double Hodge. I think a lot of players are sort of under this misnomer, or I don't know if that's the right, I don't know if I'm using that word right, but I think they're under the wrong impression that Zed likes GA. He does not. And the reason why is because when Zed casts, he basically de-aggroes. He teleports so far away from the unit that he was just on that most of the time that unit just stops focusing him entirely. So it's not always the case, but most of the time, you don't really need that GA proc to win fights. So GA is normally not advised. You can also see very few times, alternatively, players will put blue buff or BT on Zed. BT is not as good. He kind of wants to go in and assassinate. He doesn't actually care too much about survivability as long as he assassinates the carry and gets his job done. Blue buff is also a build that was prevalent during the PvE and is still acceptable, but it's one of those things that like you slam it because you have to, not necessarily because you want to. That could have been double Hodge, right? But at the end of the day, you got to play your tempo, and again, we'll talk about that a bit more with the variations. GS, Deathblade, Titans, and Sterak's, again, these are all fine, but I guess like if there's like a priority list, like probably GS is up there, BT's up there, in terms of like alternative items. Sterak's is fine, Titans is fine, blue buff is fine, right? So like there definitely is like a slight priority, but you really do want that IE double Hodge if you can get it. But again, you shouldn't be too greedy with your items. Zed, artifacts wise, actually I would argue loves Death's Defiance. I think Death's Defiance Zed is so unbelievably good, and it feels so unbelievably good. But if somebody has like some other like anecdotal evidence or whatever to prove me otherwise, fine. But in my experience, playing Death's Defiance Zed feels fucking amazing. Triforce is great on him as well, and Prowlers is great on him as well, just for that extra dash. I mean, this is pretty self-explanatory. I think that's okay. Draven, i.e. Guardbreaker Shojin is, I would argue, BIS. You can maybe switch out the Guardbreaker for something else like Last Whisper or Deathblade or GS. Typically it is Shojin IE though. Those two are sort of fixed, and then the +1 can be kind of whatever. Guardbreaker, I just like it a lot, but I do think because like as he's casting, he does hit a lot of units that have shields, so it is nice to get a little bit of that bonus damage amplification, so I think it's nice. But there are, again, other alternatives as well. Last Whisper is fine, Deathblade is fine, GS is fine. These items are much closer as alternatives rather than the Zed ones, which are sort of like, it's very clearly tiered, but Draven, it's like you can kind of get away with anything. Artifacts wise, he's actually not as enabled as Zed is when it comes to artifacts. So even though snipers is pretty good on him, it's not like you see snipers you go, I'm immediately playing Draven. It's very good though. Collector is fine as well. Mana Zane's fine as well. These are great. Basically, Collector, you just get that execute on his cast, and then Mana Zane, he just gets to cast infinite. Both are great. Both are, you're happy to have them, but are you like pivoting your whole game plan and warping your decision making because you hit these items? No, not necessarily. So bunch of different things that you could be doing with these artifacts instead, but they happen to be also good on Draven. Galio, I think out of all of these, I think Evan Shroud and Gargoyles are the only ones that like really matter, and then Warmogs is kind of whatever. And I know some people, especially higher elo, will argue like Gargoyles or Warmogs doesn't really make a lot of sense. I still think it's fine. Warmogs is because of the 4 Bastion trait. You usually end up playing 4 Bastion in one way or another, so you get a lot of resistances, and then that scales with, it's multiplicative with other stats, and then you got a bunch of HP, so it works well. Gargoyles may seem a bit counterintuitive because of the Bastion trait as well, but there's a little bit of positioning that we'll talk about later that will justify it a bit more, but again, we'll talk about that a little bit later down the line. Finally, Leblanc. I think this is going to be the part of that third niche variation we'll talk about later. I don't think Leblanc's items are very flexible at all. I think you actually have to go Shojin, Nashor's, Archangels, or you are just 8th anyways. Realistically, if you're playing LeBlanc carry, you might be 8th anyways. But on top of that, if you don't have these, you're just like most definitely 8th. This is a very niche variation, and we'll talk about it later. I think there's like very few case scenarios where you could actually consider playing this line. But again, we'll talk about it in a bit. Vi's over here in the corner because nobody likes her, but also because you should never play around Vi. Also, the Vi hero augment is fucking horrid. It is terrible. So I just don't think it's very good. So we'll put her in the corner there. First off, let's now talk about the variations, and the first one is this one. This is the main variation. I would say this is the main line that you'll see most players playing, and is Draven 3, Galio 3. It is very simple. Reroll on 7, and you get the Galio 3 and the Draven 3. Normally, you're cashing out at about like 3-7. If you're 4-3, if you really want to push it, but most of the time, you want to make sure that when you're playing Cypher, you have like at least 2 lives left. So typically, you end up cashing out on 3-7, especially if you 10 lost. Unless you're like the god of lose streak, then maybe you could push to 4-3, but that's almost never the case. Draven 3 is nice because he actually just does so much damage, and if you position him well, aka the opposite of the opponent's carry, right? So for example, if this is the full board and you're playing Draven, and you would ideally position him in the left corner on D1 because your opponent put their carry on the opposite corner, and Draven will just snipe and just kill it. Very nice. Really simple. This is going to be the main line. I think a lot of people like this one a lot because Draven 3 feels pretty good, and I think a lot of players don't really hold Draven too often. If you're playing into the Zeri line, especially inside of Exotech or inside of Nitro, your rapid fire is typically going to be a Kindred instead. So most of the time, people are not holding this Draven unit, so it feels good to have something to fall back on, especially considering how contested Zeri is in the current meta. I think a lot of people, especially the lower elo you go, the more Zeri becomes prevalent. It's also nice as well because you also have the Zed, which is nice. I think Zed is becoming a bit more popular in the meta. Not popular enough that you are playing a lottery, but popular enough that you might be contested a little bit for Zed, but not enough that like you won't be able to find it eventually. This is sort of the main way you would play this line. Again, the Gargoyles is because of some positioning stuff, and I guess we can talk a little bit about the positioning stuff right now, but basically the idea is pretty simple. When you play this main line, actually, let's go back here real quick. When you play this main line, this is the level 8 board. Obviously, you're just not playing the Renekton. If you find Renekton on 7, then you just don't play the Jax. It's really straightforward. But normally you're playing like 3 Bastion or whatever, but you normally have the Galio and the Zed to some degree. And the reason why Gargoyles, and I want to fall back on this, Gargoyles I think is good, is because of the way this front line is positioned. You might notice this front line looks a bit awkward. It doesn't look like a very standard or typical way you'd position your front line. And we'll go over why that is. And the main cases are Sejuani and Zed. This is sort of like the 2 main reasons why this front line looks the way that it does. When it comes to positioning, your Sejuani and your Zed are the 2 most important units you need to position at all times in this line. And then Draven's probably a 3rd if you're playing Draven 3. But the reason is this. Zed likes to dash 4 hexes away. That's the way that his ability works, right? So for example, if you position him here, you typically do 1 off the center, and the reason is because if your opponent's carry is here, over here in the corner, then Zed will go 1, 2, 3, 4, and on his first catch will dash immediately onto your opponent's carry. So you can actually snipe the carry very easily. Sejuani wants to be either here, 2 away from the corner, either in A2 or in A6. The reason being is that if she's in A6, she can actually cast and actually stun this whole area here on the right side. So if your opponent's carry, let's say you missed the Z positioning and your opponent ends up positioning here, well, congratulations. Now Sejuani will cast on this side instead and CC the backline, and the Draven can actually ult and actually snipe as well if you happen to have the Draven here too. So there's a bunch of different ways you can play around this, and I think if you position properly, I think this line actually has a lot of potential to like almost be unstoppable. Obviously, there are some other like edge cases, like if you play into a high roll Rengar scenario, Rengar could just jump onto the Draven and kill your Draven, and that's just that. It's just a bad matchup for you. But I think most front to back fights, you are actually really happy positioning in this sort of manner. Again, and then part of the reason is if you really wanted to, and why Gargoyles can be good, is because sometimes Galio ends up just kind of being like the solo frontliner here, and I think that he can really hold it down with Gargoyles, and I think that's good enough to get you by before the Renekton walks up and like can help on this side, or maybe some other shenanigans are going on, and that seems fine. Jax is here on the outside as well, only for one reason, and that's because most of the time the Sejuani unit is really hard to find. So what ends up happening is that you just cannot find Sejuani 2 most of the time, and even if you do, sometimes you just don't have the items because you want items on Draven, you want items on Galio, you want items on Zed. So to make sure Sejuani casts, you can put a Jax here just to make sure that Jax takes a little bit of that initial aggro, so Sejuani has a better chance of getting that cast off in order to stun the right side of the board here. If you were to position on the opposite side, again, it's really simple. You just make sure Sejuani is 2 away, right? That way she can cast on this side here. You'd probably put Renekton on this side instead. I think the way his hex works is like this. And then Zed could be on this side, he could be on this side. But again, the Galio kind of ends up isolating himself and a lot of the times. So I actually think Gargoyles is really nice on this Galio unit. Again, Evan Shroud is nice as well. You most of the time end up putting it on Galio because if you can, you kind of want to get away with not putting Last Whisper on Draven. Still, the stats are amazing and play what you hit. But at the end of the day, I do think Evan Shroud is going to be Turbo Biss in this line. And obviously for Sejuani, you definitely want to find a Vow at some point. So a lot of items go a long way everywhere, but this is sort of the main rationale behind the positioning. Now, we've talked about the positioning, we've talked about the main line. Let's talk about a couple of variations. And the first variation we should talk about is going to be this sort of push 8 variation instead. This is the most prevalent when you are contested for Draven, and more specifically, it's like you scouted stage 1, you notice that you're not the only one who has a 3-cost Cypher unit out of the orb, so you're gonna go, holy shit, now there's 2 Cypher players in the lobby, what do I do? Well, if that's the case, you probably don't want to go for this Draven line because most of the time what ends up happening is that you both roll on 7 for Draven, neither of you hit, or maybe the other guy always hits actually, so fuck that shit, but the other guy ends up hitting and then you're just sad and then you just lose the game because you're stuck on 7 with the Draven too. So this alternative is you play around Zed and Zeri instead, and you kind of prioritize a little more on the Zeri items if you know pretty early on that you're going to be like, okay, you know what, I'm not going to play around this Draven, I'm going to play around Zeri instead, and you can go for this instead. I will say this though, if you're going to do this, make sure you roll earlier than the rest of the lobby, because this variation requires 2 important key factors, and I don't know if you can tell, it's Sejuani 2 and Zeri 2. If you don't have these 2, you are fucked. So this variation is really only enabled if you have something like a really strong econ augment in the early game, something like Hedge Fund, something like Level Up. I think these are augments that can really enable you to potentially look into playing this variation instead, rather than the Draven in case you need, in case you can't because you are contested. I would say, again, like, Level Up is a little more precarious. This is sort of saying, like, I am not playing Draven, period, right? From, like, 2-1, you are not playing Draven. But, like, other times, like, something like, for example, like Raining Gold, especially if it's on the left side, on, like, a hacked augment, it gives you extra gold on top of Raining Gold, like, sure, like, this is a lot more plausible. The items as well, I think, is important to note because, again, at the end of the day, you probably are playing around Draven for quite a bit of time. Obviously, you could just lose streak and just call it there, but I think if you end up having to itemize Draven and Zed and Zeri, Sword Overflow is a really underrated augment in this line. I think there's so many swords that can be eaten up here. Zed can use so many alternative items that use swords. Draven likes Deathblade, he likes IE. Zeri likes Gunblade. Draven also like Shojin has a sword in it, so there's so many ways to kill sword in this line that, like, I think Sword Overflow is actually fantastic in this line, and it helps you itemize a ton of units. So this is going to be sort of the main secondary variation. Obviously, if your third your third Exotech is a good item, Flux is really great on Zeri. Also, the other red one, I believe it's this one here, what's it called, Pulse Stabilizer. Yeah, Pulse Stabilizer is also really good on Zeri, and if you don't hit either but you hit a tank one, that's fine. Throw on Sejuani, just get a second Gensu's on Zeri, call it there. Very, very straightforward. Now, finally, let's talk about the third variation. And now, let me warn you. This is not a line I have seen anybody play and succeed with. I know it exists, and I think it doesn't exist right now in the current meta because the numbers are bad. I think, especially after the AP strat nerfs in the B patch, this line has lost a lot of potential. Kobuko is no longer a really good unit, and ideally in this line, you actually want to itemize a Kobuko 1 over a Nico 2, but the Kobuko 1 unit is like the fakest news of all time. You actually just do not play this unit anymore. So there's a problem there. It just doesn't feel very good. I think on level 8, what ends up happening is that you end up dropping the Kobuko, which kind of sucks because you lose Cyber Boss value. You lose Bruiser as well, but Cyber Boss is sort of like the bigger hit here. You could instead, if you don't find the Renekton, you can just play Kobuko instead, so that's fine. Renekton fits perfectly just for the Bastions and for the Divinicore, so as you can tell, the traits work out very nicely in this line. But there's a couple of problems with this board. The first one is that you cannot roll on 6 for LeBlanc. This line will only work if it ever does, because you decided to not roll for the LeBlanc, but you held the LeBlancs on your way to 8, and then you eventually found LeBlanc 3, and then you can pivot into it. So I think that realistically speaking, that happens almost never. It happens sometimes, because sometimes you do just end up just pushing 8, and you just hold the copies, and you just get there, I don't want to say for free, but you definitely can get there. I would say Heroic Grab Bag is probably really, really great in this line because it just kind of helps you ensure that you can find the LeBlanc later down the line. And especially considering how unpopular this unit is, I don't think it's too unrealistic to say that, like, hey, maybe I can play this line because I'll be able to find the copies because no one's holding this LeBlanc unit. It's possible. Another thing I really don't like about this as well is that it's very, very item hungry. So you want the Zed as your duo carry. You could do Ziggs as your duo carry as well. But I think with LeBlanc and Ziggs as your only 2 carries, this comp suddenly becomes incredibly susceptible to like Zed units. To if some Shaco high roller reroller is in your lobby, which Shaco reroll can work. I've seen it happen very few times. It can work, but you become susceptible to that. Rengar is the big one that you are really scared about because if you fight into Rengar, this can be a really big problem. So there are some like really terrible matchups that exist. So that's also a part that is really scary. You have to kind of itemize everything. You want to itemize the Nico, you want to itemize the LeBlanc, you want to itemize Ziggs, you want to itemize Zed. Finally, as we had discussed earlier, LeBlanc items, I think Shojin Nashor's Archangels is truly non-negotiable. You actually cannot play this unit with anything else. Maybe Shojin Nashor's Rabadons, maybe. But realistically speaking, I think that she does not cast enough to send enough sigils to the point where she's clearing the board. I think most of the times what ends up happening is that I think her ideal perfect build is blue buff Nashor Shojin, but her numbers are not there yet. So you actually need the damage amp that comes from Archangels as the fight progresses. So I think that this is a viable line, but it requires so many conditions to go well in order to hit this. And plus, on top of the fact, you still need Nico 2, you still need Zed 2, you still need Ziggs 2, you still need LeBlanc 3. A fuck ton of shit needs to go well. And it also doesn't help with the fact that I think recently, a lot of players are becoming a lot more comfortable playing the 5 Street Demon line, which we'll talk about in the meta-analysis of the B patch. There's a mid-patch analysis I'm releasing tomorrow, so you can look out for that. But in that line, you have Ziggs and Nico and Echo, and a lot of these units are actually contested nowadays. Usually you'll have at least one AP player. So that becomes a bit of a problem. So overall, this line has way too many niche conditions, and I think it can work. It definitely has the potential to work, but there's just one, the low HP is bad. 2, the number of itemizations and the units that you need to itemize is really tough. 3, the fucking Rengar line being such a fucking terror for any front and back lines, causing you to be very, very scared, especially if you rotate into a Rengar early, like soon after your intel cash out, because then suddenly it's like, hey, now I'm just 1 life, I was supposed to be 2, so this is a problem. I think nowadays, when you play Cypher, you actually might want even 3 lives because of the current meta being so like Rengar-centric and like backline Axis-centric, so that can be a bit of a problem. And then 4, you need to find Nico 2, Ziggs 2, Zed 2. Too much shit needs to go right. So this exists, and I think in the future patch, if numbers shift around, this could eventually become the meta line for Cypher, but I don't think currently the way things stand, it'll do too well. I think at the end of the day, I think LeBlanc 2, like for this to work, LeBlanc 2 would need to be a good enough unit that it can kill shit if you're still stuck on like LeBlanc 2 during stage 4, and then I think like you would need Ziggs 2 to be able to pull a bit more of his weight, and Kabuko needs to be a real unit. Like, there's just too many things that need to go right, and right now, that is just not the case. So, it exists. Keep it in the back of your mind, and if you're really curious, these are the stats on the line, and again, it's a 4.13 average with like a top 4 rate of 57%, but also, if, you know, just like with any line, if you find the 2 stars, suddenly, it's like skyrockets to like a 2.8 if you hit everything, but it's really hard to get there. Painfully hard to get there. So, it exists, but I don't think it's like, it's not like a line that you should immediately be thinking, I must play into this. It's like, I am playing Cypher, but there's like 3 other Cypher units, or 3 other Cypher players in the lobby, and even then, why the fuck are you playing Cypher? But then you're like, I have like an Archangel and like, I have like an Archangel Nasher Slam start. Ooh. Okay, fine, maybe. But that's basically gonna cover that variation right there. Anyways, I hope this video was helpful. If you want to see a VOD of one of these variations being played, I will link this in the description below. I do think this video is running a bit too long, but this was a game played by Dishsoap, obviously currently rank 1 in North America. Actually, T-Lights might be rank 1 at this point. I'm not entirely sure. But I will link this timestamped in the description below if you want to go see one of these variations being played. And if you have any questions about any of these lines or any of the variations, positioning, itemizations, whatever, corrections, if I got something wrong, let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your opinion. But that's gonna do it for today's video. I hope this was helpful. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one, especially tomorrow for the mid-patch analysis. So until then, take care. Happy climbing.